This is Team Trudeau 2.0. It's a bigger cabinet, with most people putting on new hats, but perhaps most different is the backdrop. Since 2015, among the issues that forced their way into the spotlight, climate change, pipelines, regional divisions, and of course, the new reality of leading a minority government.
We recognize that this Parliament will be one in which collaboration, in which working with a broad range of parties and indeed stakeholders across the country is going to be incredibly important.
So what do today's appointments signal about how the Trudeau government plans to govern? And in the face of so many challenges, does it get the job done? Rosie's away this week, but At Issue is here for a special Wednesday edition. I'll try not to muck it up too badly. Chantal Hébert is joining us from Ottawa. We've got Jason Markusoff in Calgary and Andrew Coyne here in Toronto. Let's start with a short clip, folks. One of the big moves of the day, what Trudeau had to say about the appointment of Chrystia Freeland to Intergovernmental Affairs.
Our ability to work well together on these issues that quite frankly, touch national unity, touch energy and environment, touch relations with all provinces and all regions of this country is going to be extremely important.
And Chantal, let's start with you. To that point in your column, you talked about Freeland as being Trudeau's unity minister, in a manner of speaking. Does that signal, her appointment signal that this is going to be Trudeau's most pressing issue to deal with?
It's certainly going to be his most pressing issue if he is going to hope within the short time span of a minority government to advance some of the key issues on his agenda without actually making divisions worse in the country. But there's a bit of a new dog, old trick to this. Last time Justin Trudeau was taken by surprise by a game-changing event, that would be the election of President Trump. What did he do? He redeployed his team along the Canada-US lines. In this case, he has redeployed, and with the same minister in the lead, his army along the internal line on the unity front.
Right. And Andrew, how well does she do on that?
Well, in many ways, she's still the Foreign Affairs Minister, not only because she will still have responsibility for Canada-US relations, but she's essentially the emissary of a government to a region of the country that it barely has diplomatic relations with. And I think she's hampered by there's not actually that much she can offer them, partly because the government is not going to retreat on some of the major files that have so irritated the political class, particularly in Alberta and Saskatchewan and the public at large. But also because the government is focused like a laser, it seems to me, and you can see it in this cabinet, on winning seats in Quebec. Their main objective in this parliament is to win a majority of the next government. That's going to be in Quebec, not in the West. You can see it in the 10 ministers they've appointed from Quebec. And so they're not going to do anything to jeopardize that either. So she can keep a lid on tensions. She can try and put soft words. She can try and negotiate with people. But I think their overriding priority, beyond even legislative accomplishments, is just making yards in Quebec.
And that raises, such an important point, right? And I do want to spend some time talking about Quebec, but Jason, I do want to hear from you just on, Andrew kind of raised the question of what she can offer to this ongoing issue. What is your sense of what Freeland could actually do to kind of bridge that East-West divide?
They didn't give much leash to her or to other ministers to say much about this. When they kept on diverting, when asked, they would say, we have to listen and take into heart the concerns of all Canadians. We're here for all Canadians, when asked specifically about the West. When pinned down, she said they're going to do a very, very good job of listening. One of the tensions, as Andrew kind of hinted at, was that they have to not only win over. They want to win Quebec, and they also have to, win over votes to stay afloat from the Bloc Québécois and the NDP. And doing some of the things that Kenny and Mo wanted to do, the premiers in Saskatchewan and Alberta, which is basically implement the Conservative platform, is not going to do it. I think there was some craftiness in picking the chief diplomat, the foreign affairs minister, as in this role of chief minister for Western alienation, basically. It's that diplomatic words are going to be important because we know from many, many grievances that Albertans and Saskatchewanites have, that if you say the wrong things, people have deep memories. It can be in a way like China or like Russia or like Trump.
But they also needed a face with a profile high enough to not be the face of Justin Trudeau. because some of the federal arguments in this discussion are based on facts, and they're not getting through in part because they are being presented by Justin Trudeau, who has become a polarizing presence in many of those discussions. So I don't think they picked Chrystia Freeland so much for her talent for diplomacy as for her capacity to keep her cool when everyone else is climbing up the ceiling.
Since we're talking about Freeland's profile, Chantal, I'm just curious to think her appointment as Deputy Prime Minister. What did you make of that?
Well, that is how, I mean, the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs is a second-rank minister in most governments, including at the time of the referendum. But if you add the title of Deputy Prime Minister, you're kind of signaling that this is the number 2 person in the government. So when that person speaks, presumably, she speaks with some notion that what she is saying is backed by her title and her influence. We'll see over the long run whether that is true.
It's an honorific, mostly. It signals important things, as Chantal says, but nobody can really describe the duties of a deputy prime minister. For that matter, most of the titles in the cabinet are honorifics. There's probably maybe a dozen ministers with any real responsibilities in the cabinet. The rest of them have made-up titles, made-up departments. They're basically there as prizes to be handed out to treasured demographics and regional groups, and rather than because of their actual responsibilities.
Okay, let's talk about Quebec, and Jason, I want to hear from you on this because it touches on the East-West divide that we're seeing. So 10 MPs, as we've mentioned, from Quebec seated around the cabinet table. Here's what Trudeau had to say about that.
We have an opportunity and a need to ensure a clearer, stronger voice amongst our great team of MPs from Quebec and cabinet ministers from Quebec to ensure that the messages that we're hearing from and the engagement with Quebecers is done in the strongest possible way.
So, Jason, clearly there's a strategy there. The question is, can he bridge the East-West divide if he has, 10 Quebec MPs around the cabinet table and not a single one representing a riding from Alberta or Saskatchewan there?
He did a pretty dismal job of regional representation entirely. I mean, beyond the fact that there were no ministers to pick in Saskatchewan and Alberta, he did basically the bare minimum everywhere else, just ticking one in each of the Atlantic provinces, one low-level minister in Manitoba, four in BC, no new faces, nobody in the West. He's just really interested in ticking boxes elsewhere. In Quebec, where he had the luxury of many MPs and wants to give priority to new voices and shine a light on some priority issues, he was going to. As Andrew points out, there's a real strategy to get more votes in Quebec. And that's going to be through, stressing climate change. I noticed that they weren't talking much about the Trans Mountain Pipeline like Trudeau had right after the election. And that's probably because a lot of environmentalists were really frustrated with Trudeau this week by not appointing Stephen Guilbeault, the former environmental activist, to his environment minister, something that would have completely inflamed tensions in Saskatchewan and Alberta.
Right, and so many of the questions that we did hear from reporters today who were from Quebec were on the question of why Stephen Guilbeault wasn't being appointed as environment minister. Chantal, what was your sense?
Mostly because anyone who has covered Quebec and Stephen Guilbeault knows him to be a moderate bridge builder and not someone who wants to burn down pipelines. And on that basis, from the perspective of the people who were asking, he would have been a natural for the environment portfolio. That being said, he is spending a much better evening as Heritage Minister tonight than if he'd become the biggest target in the new cabinet by being the Environment Minister. And one doesn't need to be the Minister of the Environment to have a voice at the cabinet table. But 10 ministers from Quebec versus 17 from Ontario, I guess, you can't make up ministers from Saskatchewan and Alberta when you have no MPs. So it doesn't sound like it's that disproportionate, frankly, but you have to keep in mind that Justin Trudeau at this point leads the only still standing strong federalist party in Quebec, in a province that has been known to turn on a dime and where he will have serious issues with the current government of François Legault. So these voices, they're not just to be heard at the cabinet table to pull the blanket towards Quebec, they are also to be used to talk to Quebecers about a perspective different from that of the Bloc Québécois.
It's not just the number of ministers, of course, it's the significance of the departments. I mean, Quebec's getting foreign affairs, justice, treasury board, heritage, economic development. These are some pretty weighty portfolios, all things considered. And as I say, if you thought that there was any doubt about what the government's intentions were and where it sees its majority lying, they can be set to rest after today.
So as you look to the question of what this tells us about how this government plans to govern, Jason, let's start with you on that last question.
Well, this is not an entirely ambitious government with a whole bunch of things they really want to do, not like the last government where they wanted to, cut income taxes, legalize marijuana, tackle assisted dying, start with climate change. The crisis they have, they're going to try to put to bed with Chrystia Freeland the USMCA. They're going to work their way through climate change, work their way through pharmacare, and their big inflaming crisis, it seems right now, is the extreme tensions in the West and Quebec. So they're going to try to solve that with many hands.
Chantal, final thoughts?
Okay, one, I don't think there are extreme tensions in Quebec in the way that there are in the West, and I've been to both places, so it's a pretty quiet place by comparison at this point. Two, if you're going to have tensions in the Liberals, you're better off with having tensions in the West where you don't have many dogs in the battle for a majority than having them in Quebec. I think this is a government that expects to be in an election in 2 years and knows that it can't afford to make mistakes, and that means that prudence is the best option.
Andrew.
One of the things Justin Trudeau announced when he first took power was that cabinet government was back. Cabinet government is not back. Most of the major decisions will continue to be made through the Prime Minister's office. A cabinet of 36 is a monstrosity. It may have become the norm in recent years in Canada, but Mackenzie King, governed Canada through a depression and a world war with a cabinet of fewer than 20. Mike Pearson put in the welfare state with a cabinet of, I think, a couple of dozen. We don't need, most countries around the democratic world don't have cabinets this large and this bloated. What you see with this cabinet, as with previous cabinets, is cabinet that's been reduced basically to a kind of a representative assembly, a kind of a ceremonial body, really, with a few ministers who have actual responsibilities and the rest are there as window dressing.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to the At Issue podcast. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, and on our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational. Rosie and the At Issue panel will be back next Thursday.